Well, hello again, folks. Today we're looking at the second chapter of First John. And John starts this chapter with a section discussing the importance of following God's commands. Now, his motive behind this is not one of duty or guilt, perhaps, but rather he states that in following God's commands, we gain assurance that we do indeed know God. So in John's mind, those who truly know God, that is, those who truly have fellowship with him, those who walk in the light and have had their eyes opened to Jesus, those people will also then obey God's commands. That is to say, their lives will be marked out by obedience to God, they will be allegiant to God, and there would be evidence of them following his will. And John really is challenging the kind of hypocritical attitude that Christians can often be accused of. That is, saying one thing and then doing another. So he says in verse 4, if you declare that you know God, but your actions don't reflect that in any way, then actually you're a liar. And John's point is clear. You cannot be a Christian if you have absolutely no drive within you to follow God's commands. That seems to be a part of what it means to love God and to know God. John says in verse 6, whoever claims to live in God must live as Jesus did. What a challenge that is. Now, of course, this does not mean perfection. If it did, this would be entirely out of place in the Bible. It would even contradict everything that has just been previously mentioned in this very letter by John himself, because he's already described in chapter 1 that anyone who claims to be without sin is fooling themselves, and the truth is not in them. So he's already encouraged a habit of confessing sin and receiving God's forgiveness. So John is not saying that we've got to live perfect lives as Jesus himself did. Rather, what he's saying is there should be a commitment to living for God, a drive to be obedient to his will and command. And in our moments of weakness, in our moments of failure, we confess our sin, we receive God's mercy, and then we carry on again, walking in the light. Now, folks, this might sound scary, it might sound difficult, it might frighten us. Anyone who truly knows God will keep his commands. It's like a heaviness weighing upon us, perhaps. But actually, we shouldn't be receiving that with heaviness. It's not that we say, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm always sinning, maybe I don't actually know God, maybe I don't actually have fellowship with him. You see, John is writing this, in fact, for our assurance. He's saying, this is how you can be certain that you do, in fact, know the Lord. This is how you can be sure that you're in genuine fellowship with him. You should see evidence within you of a commitment to God's commands, not perfection, but a desire to follow Jesus and live as he lived. John then mentions an example of anyone who hates their brothers or sisters in the Lord, that is, fellow believers, your church family. And actually, this is a reference to the secessionists that we mentioned yesterday, this group of people who were denying Jesus' divinity. So basically saying he's not God, he's not God's son. And they were teaching this false message in the church. They were also guilty then of kind of separating themselves from other believers, pushing people out who were not accepting their teaching and therefore hating other fellow believers. And John says this kind of behavior points to the truth that these people are not, in fact, in genuine relationship with God. Their teaching is false. That's a big marker. And their behavior is not reflective of Christ at all. And so they live not in the light, but in darkness. So John then moves on in the chapter. He takes a bit of time to affirm the believers that he's writing to, because he's not writing to the secessionists. He's writing to the actual believers in the church. He trusts that they are not going to be led astray. He acknowledges their faith and their understanding of the important truths of Scripture, that is, the forgiveness of sin and the divinity of Jesus. And then he gives this warning in verse 15. He says, do not love the world. A very relevant message even for today. And he goes as far as to say, if anyone does love the world, love for God is not in them. That's a huge statement for John to make. And he explains the heart of his concern then in verse 16. He's aware of the sinfulness of our broken, corrupted world. He's aware of the temptation that abounds. That is the lure of wealth, or the appeal of power, or the desire of lust. John knows that these temptations are all around. And he warns the believers that as Christians, we are to fight those temptations off. We cannot just give in. And he urges them to have a right perspective in verse 17, to see that this world is temporary, but God is eternal. So the world and its desires, they are fickle. They may seem appealing and attractive, but actually as we give in, we're guilty of that kind of tunnel vision. We're guilty of only seeing what's right in front of us instead of looking beyond to eternity. The only thing that should drive our choices and our desires in life is God's will. We should want to please God in the long run, not please ourselves in the here and now. And clearly, given the location of this command in his writing here, John is connecting this kind of thing with having a true fellowship with the Lord. So the implication stands that those who truly know God will walk in his commands and will not simply give in to the world's desires at whim. Finally, then, in this chapter, John hammers home the wickedness of these secessionist teachers who are infiltrating the church. He describes them as antichrists. This is extreme language, of course, but it's more than appropriate, since these people were denying that Jesus was the Son of God. They were denying that Jesus and the Father were one, and they were teaching others to follow suit. And that's key. It's one thing to believe a certain thing, but it's another thing to teach others to follow suit, teach others to deny Christ's divinity, and so on. And so anyone that does these things must be rejected, in fact must be ousted from the community of believers. There can be no debate about these fundamental truths of Scripture. It's one thing perhaps to disagree about, song choices in a church service, or even to disagree about more serious things like spiritual gifts. But it's another thing altogether to deny Christ and to teach some kind of warped, twisted gospel. John leaves no room for confusion here. He calls these people liars. He says that they do not know God and they do not love him. They are leading people astray, and sadly it is only toward damnation, and so they are to be rejected wholeheartedly. On that note then, we come to the end of chapter 2. Join us though on Monday as we move into chapter 3. Until then, have a blessed weekend.